Have you ever judged someone at first glance, only to realize later that you were completely wrong? A flight attendant did exactly that. She snapped at an elderly man, thinking he was just being difficult, without knowing he was actually an American legend. But the real story is yet to unfold. You won't want to miss this. Dear listeners, before we move forward this story, please subscribe my channel to hit 1,000 figure. The cabin lights dimmed as American Airlines Flight 417 cruised at 35,000 feet. Passengers settled into their seats, some dozing off, others flipping through in-flight magazines. It was a routine flight, until Clint Eastwood started feeling uneasy. At 93 years old, the legendary actor and director wasn't as invincible as the cowboys and detectives he had played on screen. His throat felt dry, his breathing a little labored. He needed water. He pressed the call button. Moments later, a young flight attendant named Jessica approached with a practiced smile. "Yes, sir?" she asked politely. Clint's voice, though weaker than in his prime, still carried that unmistakable Eastwood grit. "Could I get a glass of water, please?" Jessica nodded. "Of course, sir." She returned quickly, handing him a small plastic cup filled with water. Clint drank it in one go, but the dryness in his throat lingered. A few minutes later, he pressed the call button again. Jessica returned, this time with a slightly raised eyebrow. "More water?" Clint gave a small nod. "If you don't mind." She forced a smile and left, returning with another cup. He thanked her, took a sip, and sighed. But something still wasn't right. He waited a few minutes before pressing the button again. Jessica returned, her smile now less polite, more strained. "Sir, is everything okay?" "Just need another cup of water," Clint said simply. This time she hesitated, but brought it anyway. However, as soon as she walked away, she muttered under her breath, "Unbelievable." Clint heard it. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He wasn't trying to cause trouble. But something in his body felt off. He needed to stay hydrated. So, one more time, he pressed the button. This time, Jessica didn't even try to hide her frustration. She stormed over, arms crossed, and hissed, "Sir, this is the 4th time. Why do you keep bothering me?" Clint looked up, calm as ever. "Because I need water." Jessica sighed dramatically. "Listen, mister, this is your last warning. Stop pressing this button, or I'm getting the senior officer involved." Passengers nearby turned their heads. Whispers began. Jessica had no idea who she was talking to. And Clint? He just sat there, silent, waiting, because he knew this wasn't over yet. The tension in the cabin grew. A few passengers stole glances at the unfolding scene, whispering among themselves. Who was this old man, and why was he asking for so much water? Clint Eastwood, however, remained calm. His throat still felt dry, his body weak. He needed water, nothing more, nothing less. After a few moments, he pressed the call button again. This time, Jessica snapped. She stormed over, hands on her hips, her voice loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "Sir, I told you. This is your last warning. Stop pressing the button. You are disturbing the crew and other passengers." A hush fell over the cabin. Clint didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he just looked at her, his piercing blue eyes steady and unreadable. "Miss, I just need some water." Jessica rolled her eyes dramatically. "What is wrong with you? Do you think you own this plane or something?" That's when a deep voice from the front of the cabin cut through the tension. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" A tall man in a crisp uniform stepped forward. the senior flight officer. Passengers turned to look. Jessica quickly straightened up, trying to regain her composure. "Sir, this passenger keeps pressing the call button and making unnecessary requests," she said, arms crossed. "I've already warned him multiple times." The officer frowned, stepping closer. His eyes flickered toward Clint, and suddenly his expression changed. His mouth parted slightly, his posture stiffened, because now he recognized the man sitting before him. Jessica noticed his reaction and frowned. "Sir?" she asked, confused. The officer slowly turned to her, his voice low and firm. "Jessica, do you know who this is?" She blinked. "What? Number just another passenger acting entitled." The officer's jaw tightened. "Jessica, this isn't just any passenger. This is Clint Eastwood." Jessica froze. Her heart skipped a beat. The name hit her like a freight train. The passengers gasped. A murmur rippled through the cabin. People were staring now, eyes wide with disbelief. Jessica's stomach twisted. She had just yelled at one of the greatest American icons of all time. She turned back to Clint, her face paling. But Clint? He just sat there, silent as ever. And for Jessica, that was far worse than if he had fought back. Because now she knew exactly how big of a mistake she had made. Jessica's face turned pale. Her heart pounded in her chest. Clint Eastwood? The Clint Eastwood? She had just yelled at a living legend. A man whose name was synonymous with American cinema, patriotism, and resilience. The passengers around her whispered excitedly. Some pulled out their phones, trying to snap discreet pictures. Others looked at Jessica with a mix of shock and disappointment. How could she not recognize him? Jessica swallowed hard and turned back to Clint, who still hadn't said a word. His calm, unwavering gaze made her feel even smaller. The senior flight officer cleared his throat, stepping between them. "Jessica, you need to apologize." Jessica hesitated, glancing at the other flight attendants who were now watching the situation unfold. Her pride battled her regret. But she knew there was no way out of this. Taking a shaky breath, she looked Clint in the eye. "Mr. Eastwood, I am so sorry. I didn't realize who you were. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that." A long pause. Clint could have made this worse for her. He could have demanded disciplinary action. He could have embarrassed her in front of the entire cabin. But instead, he just nodded. "It's all right, miss." His voice was soft but steady. "You were just doing your job." Jessica exhaled, relief washing over her. But she still felt ashamed. She had judged him without knowing anything about him. She quickly grabbed a new bottle of water and handed it to Clint with both hands, as a sign of respect. "Here, sir. Please let me know if you need anything else." Clint gave a small smile and accepted the water. "Thank you." The atmosphere in the plane shifted. The tension eased. Passengers who had been watching now smiled, nodding with approval. Jessica had learned a lesson she wouldn't forget. But this flight wasn't over yet, and before they landed, she had one more thing left to do. The rest of the flight was quiet. Jessica made sure of that. Every time she passed by Clint Eastwood's seat, she checked on him, not out of fear, but out of genuine respect. She'd learned a valuable lesson that day: never judge a person without knowing who they are. As the plane began its descent, Jessica gathered her courage and approached Clint one last time. This time, she wasn't just a flight attendant, she was a fan. She held out her phone, hesitating. "Mr. Eastwood, I know I messed up earlier, but if it's not too much to ask, could I take a picture with you?" Clint chuckled softly. "Sure, kid." Passengers around them smiled as Jessica knelt beside Clint, holding her phone up. Click The moment was captured. When the plane landed, Clint stood up, stretched, and grabbed his hat. As he walked toward the exit, Jessica and the other attendants lined up to see him off. Jessica took a deep breath and said, "Mr. Eastwood, it was an honor having you on this flight." Clint stopped at the door, turned back, and gave her a signature Eastwood smirk. "Just remember, kid, sometimes the quietest ones have the loudest stories." With that, he tipped his hat and walked off the plane, disappearing into the crowd. Jessica stood there, still holding her phone, the picture of her and Clint glowing on the screen. This wasn't just another flight. It was a lesson she would never forget.